want to start with a question for each of the five witnesses. In your judgment, are voter ID laws racist? Professor Tolson.
Thank you for that question. So it depends. One thing we have to stop doing is treating all voter ID laws as the same.
Okay, so your answer, I want to move quickly, so it depends is your answer?
Yes, that's my answer.
Okay, so what voter ID laws are racist?
Apologies, Mr. Cruz, your state of Texas, perhaps?
Okay, so you think the entire state of Texas is racist. What about requiring an ID to vote is racist?
So I think, sir, that's pretty reductive. I'm not saying the entire state of Texas is racist.
You just said my state of Texas, so you tell me, what about the Texas voter ID laws is racist?
So the fact that the voter ID law was put into place to diminish the political power of Latinos with racist intent and had been found to have
You're
racist
asserting
intent,
that. What's your evidence for that?
The federal district court that first resolved the constitutionality of Texas's voter ID law.
Okay, so your view is voter ID laws are racist. How about you, Mr. Yang?
I agree with Professor Tolson. Voter ID laws can be racist.
Okay, that's
other
two.
context.
Mr. Science?
There are some voter ID laws that are racially discriminatory in intent.
How about in practice? In intent, fine, you say there's some racist with a malevolent intent lurking in the back of their mind. But let's just talk about it as a practical matter. When I go to vote, they ask me for my ID. I pull out my ID, I show it to them, I vote. Is that racist?
If the law that requires you to do that was motivated by racially discriminatory intent
what about the
under
effect?
our
Set
Constitution.
aside intent. Set aside intent. I'm asking about the effect.
Yes, in effect, I think that there are discriminatory effects from a number of voter ID laws.
Okay, first of all, before we dive into anything else, there is no one more shamelessly disingenuous than Ted Cruz. He says, what voter ID law is racist? And USC professor Fernita Tolson says Texas is, and Cruz says, oh, so you're saying every Texan is racist? And she's like, no, their voter ID laws are. It's honestly like having an argument with a 9-year-old. But what's worse for Cruz is that when he asks for proof, Tolson brings up the United States District Court for the Southern District of Texas, which found that the voter identification law that the Texas legislature passed in 2011 was enacted with the intent to discriminate against Black and Hispanic voters. Experts testified that more than 600,000 Texans lacked the required ID to be able to vote, and as a result of that, Texas was forced to broaden what it would accept as acceptable ID. But the same issues persist in states across the country. In North Dakota, the legislature passed a law in 2017 that required voter ID to include a current residential address that couldn't be a P.O. box, which effectively excluded thousands of Native Americans who live on reservations. The law was in effect for the 2018 election, which caused some voters to have absentee ballot applications rejected for having an invalid address. In North Carolina, the legislature passed a statute requiring voters to present a photo ID in the form of a driver's license, a state-issued ID, a military ID, or a passport. That law was struck down after a federal court of appeals ruled that it was enacted with racially discriminatory intent. And then in 2018, the General Assembly of North Carolina tried again to designate what ID would be acceptable for voting, making it so that student IDs would no longer be taken. And then that voter ID law was blocked by a court of appeals. And the list goes on and on. The fact is that a number of states have enabled strict ID laws where specific types of identification are needed to cast a ballot. But in order to secure these IDs, people usually have to provide documentation that they might not have access to, or might not be able to secure for free. And yet without that documentation, they won't be able to vote. And the racial aspect of this is borne out in the numbers. Only 5% of white Americans, a group that favors Republicans, doesn't have a government-recognized photo ID. Meanwhile, 13% of blacks and 10% of Hispanics, groups that both favor Democrats, don't have government-recognized IDs. The same is true of income disparities. Of Americans who make more than $150,000 a year, only 2% don't have ID. Meanwhile, of Americans who make under $25,000 a year, 12% don't, a rate 6 times lower than high earners. When you preclude people from voting who can't afford certain forms of ID or the means to get those IDs, such as a car or other modes of transportation, that is akin to a poll tax. And in many states and localities, when those with low incomes are minorities, then the intent and the effect of laws like this become glaringly obvious. Now, with all of that said, there is a solution here, and it's to have states offer free identification cards to everyone so that people aren't barred from voting because the only forms of acceptable ID cost money that some people just don't have. But even though we hear Republicans wailing about voter ID on a daily basis as a problem, we never hear free ID as a solution, because they're not actually looking for it to be solved. They're just making sure everyone is good and scared so that they can be justified in implementing laws that limit voting rights. And beyond that, on the issue of no voter ID being a problem, there's actually no evidence to back that up. Look at a state like California, the biggest state in the nation and one where there is no voter ID requirement. An exhaustive study spanning voter fraud for more than a decade, from 2000 to 2012, found just 56 cases of election fraud in California, with most of it actually being perpetuated by campaign officials and not the voters. Regarding the 2016 election, of the more than 23 million votes cast, the Secretary of State opened 89 investigations, of which most are issues of double voting and one is an issue of voter fraud. So let's just remember that this entire issue is seeking to solve a problem that does not exist. But of course that won't matter to the right, because none of this is being done in good faith. The hysterics are only to serve one function: to be the basis for more restrictive voting laws in the future, to be the basis to block more young people from voting, more poor people from voting, more brown and black people from voting, more people who live in urban population centers from voting. Republicans know that they will lose if everyone has the ability to cast ballots. And so instead of winning over those voters on the issues, they'd rather just make it so that they can't cast a ballot at all. So my challenge will be simple. If Ted Cruz and Republicans think that voter ID is a problem, first of all, prove it. No point in wasting time and money to fix something that isn't broken. So show any evidence that the limited resources of the government need to be allocated to this issue. And second of all, if they can do that, which they can't, but alas, then provide a solution that doesn't simply restrict scores of people who just so happen to fit the mold for Democratic voters from casting ballots. Unless, of course, the goal here isn't to make voting safer, but rather precisely to block people from voting, which, surprise, is exactly the case. So Ted Cruz and Republicans will continue their obvious scheme to rig elections in their favor by excluding voters that they don't believe will vote for them, and it's up to Democrats to pass legislation with an affirmative right to vote so that we're not constantly battling back Republican efforts to chip away at the right to vote. Democrats have the majority, and they'd better use it, or they likely won't have the chance to pass any legislation in the very near future. If you enjoyed that video and you're looking for a deeper dive, check out my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen. It's a no BS look at the top stories of the week, along with interviews with the top names in politics, like Vice President Kamala Harris, Jen Psaki, Elizabeth Warren, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, Katie Porter, Pete Buttigieg, and more. Again, that's No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen, available anywhere you listen to podcasts. Also, if you want to see more videos like this one, click the subscribe link right here on this screen to join the more than 1 million people who've already subscribed to my channel. And finally, to donate to my Don't Be a Mitch fund, where I'm raising money for a whole raft of different voter outreach and voter registration groups in the closest states ahead of midterms in 2022, including Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Texas. You can find that link on this screen as well. Thanks for watching.